Welcome back to Real Estate 101. I'm your host, Joe Tercera, and today we're going to continue our discussion on family law, and I'm pleased to be joined by John Schuman of Devry Smith Frank LLP. John, welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to be here.
So John, tell me, one of the issues that first comes up with real estate often is whether or not a home is a matrimonial home. What is a matrimonial home?
Yeah, a matrimonial home can cause a lot of problems in real estate transactions if it's not dealt with properly. A matrimonial home is any home where a husband and wife have lived together and used as a matrimonial home, which means they have used it as their family home. And a matrimonial home has special rights associated with it.
Okay, now, can two spouses or that are common law be involved in a matrimonial home scenario?
No, matrimonial homes are only for married spouses. Common law spouses, they have other rights with regard to a house or property, but unless they're both on title, it belongs to one person, and that's that one person's home.
So John, can you have more than one matrimonial home?
You can actually have several matrimonial homes. Matrimonial home is any home that you occupy with the rest of your family. So it can be the house you live in, your main house, which is what most of the matrimonial homes are.
Right.
It can also involve a cottage, and that can create all sorts of problems on separation. It can also involve a vacation property.
Okay.
And if you have a timeshare in Florida or someplace else, that can be a matrimonial home. And if you're lucky enough, you have a tête-à-pierre in Paris, that can be a matrimonial home.
Right.
Even though it's another country.
Really?
From Ontario law, it can be a matrimonial home.
So why do spouses have to consent to the sale of a matrimonial home in transactions?
Well, as I said, matrimonial homes have special rights associated with them. And spouses, both of them, when they're married, have a right to be in a matrimonial home after separation. That means that neither one of them can force the other one out. A court can force someone out, or the parties can agree that someone's going to move out, but other than that, they're both allowed to stay in the home. Because some people try to get around that by, and this is a long time ago, by selling the house to get their spouse out of it,
right.
The Family Law Act actually says you can't sell a house, you can't mortgage a house, you can't encumber a house, because these are all things that someone could conceivably do to have the house fall into someone else's hands and get their spouse out of it. So whenever someone wants to sell a house or mortgage a house or remortgage a house or have a secure line of credit against a matrimonial home, they have to get their spouse's consent. So that way their spouse knows what's going on and they can't be kicked out of the house.
Right, so full disclosure.
That's right.
Okay, so that was actually going to lead into my next question. Can someone prevent a home from becoming a matrimonial home in order to sell it or put a mortgage on it?
There are a number of ways to do it. All of them involving your spouse in the process to do that. And it's something you may want to do, especially if you have a house like a cottage, where you don't want, after you separate, for your spouse to still have a right to use the cottage. Often people don't like their spouse showing up at the cottage after they separated.
Right.
They have a right to do that. So the two main ways of doing it, or the two only ways of doing it, are that first you can go to a real estate lawyer and register a designation on title. That means you sign a piece of paper that gets put on title to the property that says this property is our matrimonial home. If you designate one property on title as the matrimonial home, every other property you and your spouse own ceases to be a matrimonial home.
Right.
So the cottage is no longer a matrimonial home. The place in the
Just
vacation home
becomes an
is
asset.
just an asset.
Right.
The second way to do it is to have a marriage contract. And the marriage contract can say that we agree that this is not going to be a matrimonial home. However, the marriage contract cannot keep someone from being in the matrimonial home. Marriage contract can say this house is our matrimonial home, but if in fact it is a matrimonial home, the marriage contract cannot remove someone's rights.
Okay. All right. So what other kinds of problems are created by a matrimonial home?
Well, a big one that loses a lot of people a lot of money is that matrimonial homes on separation, the house that is your matrimonial home on the day you separate, it goes into the property calculation at its full value. What you share when you separate is not all your assets. You share the increase in the value of your assets during the marriage.
The appreciation.
That's right. With some exceptions, and a big exception is a matrimonial home. No matter who brought it into the marriage, it goes in for the full value, which means the person who brought it into the marriage doesn't get any credit for having brought that house into the marriage. It's as if They had no money on the day they got married, bought the matrimonial home with money during the marriage, and now they're sharing that entire value with their spouse. It could be $1 million home, and on the date of separation worth $1 million, $1,001,001, and that spouse is sharing $1,001,000 with their spouse, and their spouse just made $500,000.
$500,000, right. Okay, so is there any way to get credit for bringing a house into a marriage?
There is, and again, it's the marriage contract. The marriage contract, you can set out into it that either a spouse says that I give you credit for the value of this house on the date of marriage,
right.
So you get a certain amount that credit on the date of marriage, or you can agree as to how that house is going to be divided.
Right.
So one spouse gets 20%, one spouse gets 80% on the date of separation. And these marriage contracts, they're legal in Ontario. Marriage contracts are specifically allowed, and they are not uncommon when one spouse brings a valuable asset that's going to be a matrimonial home into the marriage.
Okay. Now, how common are marriage contracts in Ontario? Like, is it something you see all the time, or?
Well, as a family lawyer, I see them all the time, and we do maybe 100 of them a year, and so it's not uncommon for people to want marriage contract when they have a matrimonial home, or when they have a parent who wants to gift them a property, and they don't want their
Right.
In-law to get held of it, because that's another issue, is that if your mother and your father gifted your house to you, usually that would come completely out of the property calculation. But if it's a matrimonial home, it goes back into the property calculation at its full value.
Right.
So what your parents may want to do is they may want to say, we'll give you the house, but your spouse has to sign a marriage contract saying that you get to keep the full value of it.
In the event that something, right.
That's right.
Okay.
So that protects the value. It doesn't make it so your spouse can stay in the house after you separate.
Right.
Your spouse still gets to stay in the house after you separate, but once there's a court order, or you agree, or you're divorced, your spouse has to get out.
Okay. So can anybody do a marriage contract themselves? By him or herself?
Well, technically they can. You can have a marriage contract, and as long as it is in writing, signed and witnessed, it can be a marriage contract. To have the court enforce a marriage contract, the court looks at some additional things. Three things specifically. The first of those is whether the parties understood the contract.
Right, at the time of signing it.
At the time they signed it. And to understand a contract, judges just assume that you need a lawyer. So you have to have a lawyer explain the contract to you so you understand all what's going on. A lot of people might not have known these rules about matrimonial homes before and signed a contract that gave away a lot of money. And the judge will say, if you didn't understand that, contract's not worth anything. You should have seen a lawyer.
Right.
The second thing is there has to be full financial disclosure, which means you have to tell your spouse how much you make, all your assets, and all your debts. So they have some idea of what your position is. It works into the understanding part of the contract, because if your spouse doesn't understand how much money you have, they may not know how much they're giving up with the contract.
Right.
And the third thing is you can't violate the law of contract, and you can't have negotiations that occur in unfavorable situations. So there's a real imbalance of bargaining power. You can't sign a marriage contract generally within a month of the wedding, because your focus in the month before you get married is on getting married, not on the contract. And you can't do things with the contract that you're not allowed to do, like agree to sell someone else's property. But if you have a lawyer, you're not going to run afoul of any of those rules.
All right. Okay. So for today's final question, let's say two people, they're married, they're about to get married, they're in love. What would you say? How difficult is it for them to discuss a marriage contract before getting married?
It is a very unromantic thing to do, and a lot of people come in kind of sheepish, saying, "I think I need a marriage contract," and my wife or my husband to be is not going to really like the idea, or I'm not sure if they like the idea. I haven't even talked about it yet. It's less a problem for people who are on their second marriage or people who are getting married later in life, right, because they know the financial realities and are thinking more about it. But for young couples, it can be a real difficult topic. Fortunately, with young couples, they usually don't have a lot of money to start off with, and it's usually someone's parents who are saying they need a marriage contract, and that can make it a lot easier to tell your spouse, look, we're going to get all this money, or we're going to have use of this property, but my parents say you have to have a marriage contract. And marriage contracts are contracts of utmost good faith. to assume at the beginning of your marriage that you and your spouse are looking after each other. So the contract should be fair, and it should recognize the situation and make things better for both of you. But again, having parents who you can blame it on makes it a whole lot easier.
Right.
We find that people who come into our office looking for marriage contracts have really given a lot of thought about what it means to be married. And they're not getting married sort of out of pure emotion. They're not sort of swept up in the whole thing. They've given some thought to it. And
so it's with good intention.
It's good intention. And that seems to indicate that they've thought about what they're going to do when they get married. And that's a good indication for the marriage. Some people say that if you're going to have a really bad negotiation about your marriage contract with your fiancé, what's going to happen when you separate?
Yeah.
Is that going to go really badly too? And what's going to like in between? If you can't talk to them about this beforehand, are you going to be able to have any serious conversations with them when something bad happens during the marriage?
All right, John. Thanks very much for coming on today's show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
If anybody has any more questions, they can get in contact with John Schuman at Devry Smith Frank LLP. I'm your host, Joe Tercera. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.